Red Script Studio presents Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series. From Columbine to Compassion, Heidi's Quest for Healing. Caution: the Trauma That Binds series contains mature subject matter that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, Podcast Nation, and welcome back to another episode of the Trauma That Binds series. Today, we have the privilege and honor to speak with Heidi Johnson. Heidi is a Columbine survivor, has an MBA and master's degree in Developmental Practice, and is the executive director of Angel Covers, an organization dedicated to providing assistance in East Africa. So just give me one moment while I get this extraordinary woman on the line. Hi, Heidi.
Hi.
Hi, my dear. How you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. Thank you for asking. I do apologize for the late start. Here we are. I do apologize.
No, it actually worked out because I didn't have WhatsApp on my computer. So I was frantically trying to put that on, as I should have looked ahead and didn't see that that's the forum we'd be meeting in. So
No, that's okay. Yeah,
all good.
So, Heidi, why don't we just start off by you telling the listeners how we got connected here, a little about yourself, and kind of your message and what we hope to accomplish today with this episode.
Yes. So my name is Heidi Johnson. We got connected on Need a Guest, a Facebook forum for connecting podcasts and podcastees, I guess. I don't know exactly the title for that. And I believe we're talking about trauma, my personal story of experiencing violent trauma and the outcomes that I have had of that, particularly as it relates to my work and what I do as a global development practitioner today.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm so glad. Again, I'm glad you were able to reach out. And we did reach out on that podcast group there. And you had told me something incredible about yourself, about your backstory, and that was that you were a Columbine survivor.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if you want me to go into my story just now. I'm happy to.
Well, it's we're more than welcome to share a little about how that how you felt during that moment, how it started, how it affected your mental health growing up. It's all up to you and what you're comfortable sharing with.
Yeah, so I was a sophomore at the time of the Columbine shooting. And basically that day, April 20th, 1999, it's hard to believe that it was 25 years ago. It makes me feel old. But it started off really as just an ordinary day, nothing out of the ordinary. It was bright and sunny, and I was at that point in time of the year, everyone's looking forward to summer. And so I had decided to go to the library during my lunch hour, and I sat down at a table, pulled out my homework and began working. Shortly into the lunch period, I began hearing loud bangs, and I had no reason to believe that I would be unsafe in my school. I never felt unsafe there, that my life could potentially be in danger. That wasn't something that would have struck me as normal by any means. So my initial inclination was, this is probably construction. The seniors always did a prank every year. I wondered if maybe it had something to do with that. And so I just began or continued working. Shortly after that, the bangs continued, and a teacher came running into the library and was incredibly frantic and basically just continued to say that a kid had been shot and told us all to get under our tables. And I watched her as she disappeared behind the teacher's desk at the front of the library. I went ahead and got under my table. There were about 6 chairs around the table, and I just remember kind of huddling into a really tight ball and pulling all of the chairs as close to my body as I possibly could, still really not entirely sure what was happening, just completely bewildered. At that point in time, pipe bombs started going off right outside of the library, and the entire library began to fill with smoke. Emergency alarms were going off, the lights shut down, and it was just this hazy atmosphere in the library. And I remained under my table. Everything was eerily quiet in the library, even though there were, probably 50, 60 kids total there. And from where my table was at, I could see the exit and the entrance of the library. It was partitioned off by books, but my table kind of poked out from the bookshelf so I could see everything. And I saw these two figures enter the library, and I could really only see their shadows at that point. But I could see and could make out that they were wearing trench coats, these long black trench coats. They had what appeared to be artillery strapped around their shoulders, and they were holding guns. The first thing that they said when they entered the library was, "Everybody get ready to die." And at that point, they just began almost systematically shooting teenagers in the library. And the timeline of what happened from that point on is a little bit fuzzy, but I do remember a good amount of it, where they would come over to my section of the library, go back to another section. I'd watch as they would point their gun under either computer cubbies or tables and pull the trigger. I could hear, the sounds of my fellow classmates, classmates who were screaming, classmates who were begging them to stop, classmates who were dying and were fighting for their last breaths. At one point in time, they came over to my section of the library and they looked underneath my table. I kind of made eye contact with them, and they had looked under and for whatever reason decided not to shoot me that day. But I was very close to losing my life. They eventually left the library to try and set off propane tank bombs that were underneath us in the cafeteria. Fortunately, those did not go off, and we were able to use that time frame that they had left the library to ultimately escape out of an emergency exit, where we were able to ultimately then get to safety.
Wow, Heidi, you're telling me this story, and I'm almost in tears. My heart's breaking for you.
Yeah.
Now, when you got to the exit and everybody and got to safety there, cops got you and got you further into safety, debriefed you, got you to your family. What was kind of the aftermath? Was there therapy that they offered as well?
Yeah. I mean, the immediate aftermath of the shooting was nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what was going on. This was the first major mass school shooting in our country's history. And so there was so much that people didn't understand and didn't know how to handle or address. And so we, as students, were escorted to a nearby neighborhood immediately after by a police car. And I waited at a friendly neighbor's house. I was able to contact my parents at that point and let them know that I was okay and that I had survived. But police began to put barricades anywhere close to the school. So I was essentially trapped in this neighborhood that I couldn't get to my family, which, still being in shock and still dealing with the immediate aftermath of what I had just went through was incredibly difficult. It just felt very lonely. And I waited until about 5 p.m. My dad had broke down every police barrier that he possibly could. He reached out to neighbors that were in the neighborhood where I was at to use their vehicles to get to me. And he was ultimately able to get to me by around 5 o'clock that evening. So much, much later. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, there was still just so much that people didn't understand about how to help children, teenagers who had gone through such a violent trauma. And while there were some resources provided, it is it was a skeletal structure to what is, I would say, provided today. I didn't pursue or seek counseling until much later, and had to kind of white knuckle my, my trauma response post Columbine for several years until ultimately I couldn't. So.
Okay, well, at least you were able to get to a safer place with that police officer. Unfortunately, it did take a little time for your father to get there, but at least he did get there. And once you were telling me that part of it, I could picture him breaking down the para gates and getting to you, because that's something I would obviously do as a father myself. So that's wonderful. Now, when we were talking before, you or what I had found out through some research, is you told your story pretty much right after this happened. How did you find the strength and confidence to be able to tell your story publicly after the shooting?
Yeah, it's a great, it's a great question. I was invited to speak at a church and tell my story. And honestly, at that point in time in my life, it was very motivated by my faith to share my story, which I would say in some ways ended up being very cathartic, but then also on one end, and then, in all honesty, ended up being very re-traumatizing on the other end too, especially not having gone through counseling. I think that there was a level of, the nuanced piece of that is that while it was healing in some ways to be able to share my story and feel like what I was sharing was able to provide some help or impact, that having to rehash the details of my story also felt exploitative in some ways, where people were very interested in learning about the nitty gritty of what happened. I understand to a point what in the aftermath of the shooting, it was something that truly shook our nation, much like 9/11 did, where people are asking how on earth could something like this happen. It didn't fit the mold for what would occur in a upper middle class neighborhood school. And so there was a lot to be grappled with. I think that, students were asking, can this happen in my school? Parents, the same thing, can this happen in our neighborhood? And it brought, the fact that a mass tragedy, a mass act of violence can happen almost randomly, that there was kind of no particular rhyme or reason, and people were wanting answers, which happens all the time when things like this happen. And so I understand why people wanted to know the story, but I also think too that what can happen in these types of situations, and definitely happened with me, is there was more consideration for my story and what I could share or provide light on than me as a person and taking care of me as a person. And that is maybe just kind of across the board, how the media would oftentimes treat us, how even speaking in churches and speaking in schools, and there was an elevation of, okay, you're able to provide maybe some level of insight and understanding and even comfort for why these things happen. And that supersedes your ability or your the care of a person to take care of them and sharing the intimate details of their trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So basically, you're sharing your story just to advocate for the others that were there beside you as well, and then so people can kind of know what happened and the true fears that were felt at the time, right?
Yeah. I think they all wanted to connect in a lot of ways, which I understand. I think, though, that in hindsight, I would have been more careful with my own heart and mind, rather than making it subservient to what people needed from me at the time.
Well, you were also like around 19 at the time, right?
So I started sharing my story pretty much right after the shooting happened. I was 15 when it happened,
Okay.
and continued to share it well into my even early 20s. in those types of forums.
Okay, so you started when you were 15, and then we've been on so many news channels. You even written a book about it, right?
I did, yeah. It was, just my initial story. It's super raw. I would go back and redo it, but I'm proud of myself for sitting down and putting pen to paper on what I went through. And again, my heart at the time was really to help people through my story. It was really to help people find hope through something that was so incredibly shocking, scary, terror inducing. I mean, you think about school should be a place where children can relax and learn and grow and feel safe. And having that disrupted, not just for me because I went through it, obviously, but it put something in the imagination of so many other students on what could be possible at their school, which is terrifying in a lot of ways.
Well, and that's exactly it. And when you had reached out to me, the one of the first things that I had said was, "Oh, Heidi, I'm so sorry. Nobody expects their school to become a war zone like that." Like,
Wow.
right? So it's just one of
Yeah.
those things. You think school is going to be safe, you expect it to be safe, and then something like this happens, and then
Hmm.
it's great that as soon as it happened, right after you were sharing your story, so everybody can kind of understand what happened there. But at the
Hmm.
same time, it probably did take a toll on your mental health, right?
Absolutely. It became hard for me because and I will say that having grown and healed a lot since then, for me to share my story now, I can share it much more at arm's length, where it almost feels like I'm telling someone else's story. I've processed through it so much. When I was young, and I think what happened too is we became these superhero students that somehow walked through fire unscathed, and people wanted to look at us almost in that light. And that was a hard thing to live up to. That was a hard thing to have to not feel like I could be a teenager, or I could come undone, or I could say, I don't want to do this interview, or I'm scared to go and speak at a school. Like that was re-traumatizing for me in a lot of ways, when I would speak in school assemblies and feel just the similarities of being in a high school again, and what that feels like. Am I safe? And really, as I mentioned before, white knuckling it and pushing myself through those things, basically ignoring my warning signs and trying to do it for the better good of what I felt like was important at the time. So yeah, I think looking back in hindsight, it's so much more different to tell my story now than it was then.
Well, like you said, as you processed it, you healed from it, and now you can kind of speak more candidly about it. Now, what was one of the most significant things that helped you heal and process through this tragic event?
I would say that my healing journey was incredibly messy. It was not something that, oh, I found therapy and I was okay. I wish I wish that would have been the case. Or I started taking, medication and I was okay. It was not that way in any way, shape, or form. I grinned and bared it until I was 25, so 10 years after. And I basically had, I would say, what I, the best way of framing it was just a nervous breakdown. It became real to me, especially as I saw mass shootings continue, and not just continue, but increase in our country. I saw mass shootings happening in my backyard here in Colorado, and me starting to have to face the fact that I could potentially go through another shooting. Shootings that were happening in theaters and grocery stores and places of worship. That to me made me face my trauma head on. And it was more than I think I was ready to handle in a lot of ways. I could not, for a period of time, function at the level that I was used to functioning at. It was incredibly hard to work at that point in time. I did not know my emotions. They were all upside down. Like I just could not seem to get a grasp on what I was feeling, why I was feeling it, why I was having the thoughts that I was having. Everything just seemed like chaos truly on the inside of me. Like it just, so much chaos. And I had no choice at that point in time to pause literally everything in my life and pursue deep, deep help. I began to see a counselor. I ultimately began to take medication, which helped regulate my hormones. And I would continue to see a counselor for years and have to work through it. I wish that I could, and I have healed, I have done the work in so many ways. And I wish that I could say like, it's perfect at this moment in time. And I never experience anything related to Columbine ever again. But truthfully, even this year around the anniversary of Columbine, the weather was similar and my body still remembers that day. I still, without even a thought, can go back to elements of the trauma I experienced. I could be put in a situation or see something that still to this day can trigger an emotion in me. And I think what I just have now that I didn't have then is the tools on how to navigate that. The ability, I think, to also say to myself, hey, let's not power through this. You need to take a break. I give myself much more grace and permission than I used to. And I need to in order to function and to make it through day to day.
You're absolutely right, especially going through something like that and then trying to have to heal and process through it. You have to give yourself the time and the grace, like you said, to be able to do so, or else you're just going to frustrate yourself and it's just not going to work.
Absolutely.
Now, how do you believe your advocacy has impacted individuals and your community?
I think, especially now, and being able to tell my story with much more authenticity and realness, and not from the way that I told it as a teenager was from a superhuman perspective of look what I survived and how I survived it. And I am not in counseling and I'm doing great. Like that was my story in so many ways. Now to be able to talk about it with authenticity and realness and what it's like to heal from violent trauma, I hope that it causes hope in others, or they're able to maybe see ways and light through their own traumas. I hope that it also maybe would spur just some levels of action as it relates to how our nation handles these consistent violent traumas. I think that it is incredibly discouraging, especially as someone who has gone and lived through this, to see how common mass shootings have become in the United States. And every time there is another mass shooting, I think about the children who have to now heal from that and how much that just rips and tears at who we are as a society and as a culture, and just the wound that it continues to create on us as a country. I think that it is in a lot of ways a collective trauma that we experience every single time that there is a mass shooting, and it's experienced at all different levels, from the people who are at the epicenter of the event to the people who have experienced similar situations like myself, to just even people who have not gone through anything like that. It still impacts all of us, and I think really tears away at who we are in a lot of ways as a society. It's traumatizing for all of us. And so I personally would love for anything that I would say or do to be able to help us move into the right directions on how do we stop these things from happening.
No, exactly. And we got to figure out how to stop these things from happening. And is that was one of your main motivations to get your MBA and master's degree in developmental practice?
Yeah, I mean, and that the work that I do is on a global basis. And I think the reason I was so drawn to global development work is because I almost as a mirror, and I know things are different and the context is different, but almost as a mirror, I saw what me at Columbine was like in the absolute state of survival. That if I had to experience what survival feels like, it was that moment in time in my life. And other than that, I live a very privileged life. I live a life where my needs are consistently met, where I have access to food and clean water and healthcare. I have all of that. But I did have that moment of survival. And that moment has spurred me on to see, I think, just what so many other people around the world face on a much more regular basis, which is lack of access to clean water and what that does on your day-to-day existence and living, lack of access to healthcare, where you don't know where to go to find a doctor when you're experiencing a health emergency, where you don't have consistent access to nutrition, or you live in states of poverty where people are literally starving to death. I think that because of what I went through at Columbine, and feeling like because I have been given so much that I am able to do something about maybe what other people in the world are facing as it relates to their own levels of survival as well.
That's great, Heidi. And is that when you also started, what was it, Angel Covers?
Yeah, so Angel Covers is an organization, and we work to provide rural health care in an area that has extremely low access. So we see patients who are dealing with things like severe acute malnutrition. That is particularly prevalent in children under 5 and causes so much preventable deaths in this part of the world. Where we see women who go into active labor and don't have a place to safely deliver their babies, or if they deliver their baby, they get an infection right away because of unsanitary conditions. So we're providing healthcare in an area that I believe is super critical and crucial. I'm so fortunate and blessed to be able to work with such a wonderful team that's on the ground. They are really the brains behind everything. I actually just spoke with our Kenyan physician today, and his heart inspires me. The things that he wants to do in the region to help people who are really suffering as a result of not having consistent access to healthcare is just remarkable. He was at his house the other day, and a family knocked late at night because their child had cut open his head, and he instantly took that child to the clinic and sutured his head closed. And so his dedication is just really amazing and astonishing to me. But we're hoping to, really prevent these deaths that should not be happening in this region of the world.
That's amazing, Heidi. I'm so glad that you were able to get that started. And that the Kenyan physician, what's his name, if we're allowed to ask?
Yeah, absolutely. His name is Julius, and he specializes in maternal and pediatric care. And so we're hoping to build a dedicated neonatal wing that will provide 24/7 birth services in rural Kenya, which will also serve Ugandans across the border as well, so that people have a safe place to go for their healthcare needs.
No, that's amazing. That is completely amazing, Heidi. And then there was something else that you
Thank you.
do to help other folks as well. With I don't know if it's part of Angel Covers or maybe it's another part of another nonprofit thing that you do, but to help women stay away or stay out of the sex trafficking.
So that was a part of another work that I did in a previous position, but I do work for an organization now where we provide clean water systems, holistic clean water systems in some of the most remote parts of Latin America, building water infrastructure that will provide clean water to people's taps, their household taps. So it's really unprecedented work, and I feel fortunate to work with just incredibly smart engineers who are doing things that I would say many have said were impossible in regions that they said, were impossible to provide consistent clean water, which when you think about having consistent access to clean water, it is the epicenter of so many things, of health, of education, thriving, getting out of poverty. And so to be able to provide or help provide something at such a base level need is so incredible.
No, that is incredible. And it's remarkable that you were able to talk with these engineers and get the system set up to be able to provide clean water for these folks that unfortunately don't have it currently, or well, now do, thanks to you and your work.
Yeah, it's very rewarding. It can be hard at times, working in the global development context. There's always challenges, uphill battles, things that don't go your way. And it's something that I've learned you just have to really develop a certain amount of grit and push through those barriers and those obstacles to make things happen.
Well, exactly. If you have the power and the passion, you just got to again power through those obstacles and make it happen, right? And one of the ways that you make things
Absolutely.
happen is by storytelling and believing and to help combat shame and help heal, right?
Yeah, I think that one of the shifts that I have seen in our culture at large is, I would say, just the ability for us to be more authentic with where we're at, more authentic with our emotions. I think that there was a level of stoicism that was prevalent when I was a teenager that almost taught that feeling emotions was a bad thing. And part of that was maybe my faith upbringing. It could be even family dynamics. But I also think, too, that it was kind of within our culture at large, is that we kept things very tight to the vest. And it wasn't okay, at least within my experience, to say, I am feeling scared. I am feeling extremely angry that this happened to me. I am feeling shame because I have these conflicting emotions about what I went through that I don't know how to make sense of. And I think what was particularly interesting, or maybe challenging as a result of going through Columbine, is it was such a public facing trauma. So you think about people going through different levels of trauma. Oftentimes those might be, for the most part, private to them or to their families. But for me, this was a widely broadcasted traumatic experience that I had, that at any moment in time, I can be out and about in my day-to-day life and see a news story that is highlighting the shooters of the Columbine shooting. I can, see or be reminded of, what happened that day just in our day-to-day media. And so it's a very public trauma. But to say that, I would say that being able to share my story and has been very important, but being able to share it in a real and authentic way that isn't telling it from the heroic perspective, but from the real and authentic perspective.
I can understand that because people love authenticity and they want to know what the real story is. They want to feel the same feelings. They want to live vicariously through you, right?
Yeah, and I think too, it's just, and maybe like what has happened is while my trauma was particularly public, is I felt very alone and isolated in my body and mind's physical response to that trauma. And I didn't know what was normal to experience or go through as a result of experiencing violent trauma. And so the more that I'm able to tell my story and see it mirrored in others, and to know that, okay, there's nothing wrong with you, Heidi. There's nothing wrong with how your body is working to protect yourself and how your body is working to keep you safe, which is something that I think I had to learn within the context of what other people have gone through. Is I would judge myself early on for feeling scared in certain situations, or I would judge myself for feeling rage, which is an incredibly uncomfortable emotion and feeling, but so incredibly normal as it relates to PTSD. And so having a community of people who have gone through similar traumas is, I think, so incredibly important, because trauma can have an isolating factor. And when you think that you're the only one who has gone through it, you kind of feel like there's something wrong with you. And I remember asking myself, am I okay? Am I okay? And to be validated in the fact that what I was experiencing, thinking, feeling is all so incredibly normal is one of the best comforts, I think, and one of the most healing comforts I think that I received post Columbine.
That's amazing, Heidi. I'm glad you were able to receive that kind of comfort for you. Now, I'm guessing this is just one out of many experiences that exemplifies your storytelling within your work, right?
Yeah, so I mean, and that definitely looks different. I would say in my work, I have to be incredibly careful. It's one thing for me to share my story and my trauma and what I went through. It's very different to share someone else's trauma and stories and what they go through. And so I think, in speaking broadly within the global development nonprofit world, and what we have seen maybe resonate with a Western audience, in that people respond to certain stories, for better or worse, that come from impoverished communities. I think we have to be incredibly careful about how we tell other people's stories. And I would say that a lot of nonprofits, and even shifts that I have made over the course of my career, we did not get this right. Is we tell the stories of others in a way that we would never want someone to tell our story. And so talking about the work that I do when sharing about, people's personal traumas as it relates to, growing up in the sex industry, or growing up or experiencing things like severe malnutrition, or having a traumatic birth experience, I always try and layer that with what would I want shared about myself. I always layer that with, did this person give me explicit permission to share their story? And do they know how I'm going to share it? And I want to do that with the utmost integrity. Sharing stories of what's happening is incredibly important in the work that we do, because it helps bring these large scale problems to a human level, which is what we need to be able to see in order, I think, to impact and in effect change. But at the same time, it needs to be done with the utmost care, because these are our people, and they deserve all of the dignity that we deserve here in the West. And I want to make sure that I give that to them when I tell their stories.
Well, I completely understand that, because it's not when it comes to somebody else's story, it's up to them to tell it, right? And especially for someone like me, when someone like you reaches out, that's why we discuss everything beforehand, and then we pick a recording day. And even then, when we talk and converse, it's what you're comfortable with sharing. I'm not here to pry. I'm not here to
Wow.
poke. I'm just here to let you tell the story how you want,
Yes, I
right?
think that's really wonderful and important.
Well, I appreciate that, Heidi. Thank you. And again, thank you for reaching out. Your story is so remarkable and incredible. And just as you are yourself, you've gone through so much, and you've healed and you've processed, and now you're using all of that to help so many people, not just in your own local area, but across the world. And like nobody can really say that, well, except for yourself and some other folks, right? Now, as someone who does kind of bridge the gap between the Western and global world, how would people here in the West be able to help, basically?
Yeah, I think as far as how people would be able to help, and it feels like such a chasm in a lot of ways, especially if we look at just how grand the issues and problems are in not just global settings, but around even our own backyard. So I would say how people can help is find an organization that you can trust. I think that it's important to really research the organization that you support. And when I say support, I mean financially, and to know what they're doing and how they're doing it. I think that it's very easy. And this is something that I think is maybe cultural for us here in the West. And it relates to just how we have been conditioned in a lot of ways, which is through advertising and through, I would say, instant gratification, that type of thing, that we are conditioned to respond to an emotional appeal very easily. And so a nonprofit that is able to tell a very compelling story, may garner good support and donations initially. But I think that for your listeners, what's important is to really look below the surface before responding emotionally, and look into the work that organization is doing and do a little bit of research, because I do think that there is a level of, for lack of a better term, poverty porn that happens within this industry, where we work to garner an emotional response or use emotional manipulation, much like happens in the advertising world, to get people to donate and to get them to provide their financial resources. But I think that we need to kind of rise above that as a society in a lot of ways. And we do that by being informed, by doing our research, and by working to ensure that where we're putting our dollars really makes the most sense and is doing the most good. And so I always encourage people to support organizations that are utilizing the local people as the main force for change in that particular region. It should not be a Westerner who is going in guns blazing trying to make change, because they don't have the cultural expertise and experience to really do what is needed in a community that they're an outsider for. So I encourage that. I encourage, obviously financial integrity, and making sure that the organization is using its resources in a way that is best promoting the impact in a particular area, that it's accomplishing the projects that it's setting out to accomplish. I would say, too, that we have, as I mentioned, this kind of default of instant gratification. And we have to understand that when working in global contexts, and it's the same here as well, but change happens slowly. And there is this level of, we want to see instant change if we're going to donate to a particular organization. And I think that there has to be a level of appetite for patience within the global development context that just says, we're going to, wait this out and allow things to happen gradually, because that's better for change in the long run, and it's going to be more sustainable at the end of the day.
You're absolutely right, because as long as we can keep something sustainable like that, that's what matters, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, looking back on your journey so far, what has been the most significant lesson you've learned?
Great question. I would say, I started this work coming in as such an idealist, which I still am. I still believe that about myself, that, when you have good intentions and a pure heart, you can really make a difference in the world. And I don't want to lose that. I do think that my idealism had to be tempered with reality in a lot of ways as I stepped more into global development work and encountered barriers, worked across cultures, worked across different countries and different governments, all of the things that are required for global development work. I think that it was important for me to not lean and sway the other way where you become so incredibly jaded, where you feel like no progress is ever going to happen, or where you feel like if I don't have the absolute right solution, then we're just not going to do anything. I think that I've been able to land in a good middle ground that is informed, but also still remains very hopeful for the world. In my line of work, it's very easy, I think, to get to a place of just feeling like, are we going to impact any change? And I want to be able to see the world through a hopeful lens, where I'm able to see, projects that we're putting into place through a lens of, maybe we won't change the entire world, or we're not going to solve the water scarcity issue, or we're not going to solve the fact that 7,000 newborns die every single day from preventable causes in sub-Saharan Africa. We're not going to solve all of that, but I can maybe help with a piece of it. And so I work to remain hopeful in that progress takes time. Change is incremental. And if we continue to just put one foot in front of the other, we're going to make the world ultimately a better place at the end of the day.
I appreciate that. No, that's some very good advice, Heidi. That's a great lesson. Now, unfortunately, we're actually coming up to the end of our session here. It's been a great conversation with you, my dear. Now,
Yeah,
what would be
absolutely.
some hopes and aspirations for you both personally and professionally in the future now?
Yeah, I would say that I am laser focused at this moment in time on working to build better healthcare infrastructure in rural sub-Saharan Africa. I have personally heard the stories of mothers who have lost their babies that didn't have to. If they had better access to healthcare, their babies would still be here. And that hits me in a very profound way, in that I would love anything that I do, if there is a child that could be here on this earth because of something that I did, I feel like my life has been worth it at some level. So I am laser focused on building better healthcare infrastructure in areas where people have incredibly low access. It is what I did my master's work on, and we established a program in rural Angola to provide safe births in a very low resource setting. And it's what I'm currently doing now in rural Kenya, as I mentioned before, working with a very dedicated and wonderful team. Ultimately, I would love to see the model that we implement expand to other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where there's just a lot of low resources. And I think some ideas in the works on how to make that happen. But right now, it's just starting small and then working to build from there.
And exactly, it all takes just small steps before you can get to somewhere, and then next thing you know, boom, you're finally right where you need to be.
Absolutely.
Now, as one of our last questions here, for our other survivors of trauma who are maybe struggling to find their own voice or purpose, what kind of advice would you give them based on your own experience?
I mean, I think ultimately, for people who have experienced violent trauma, find a safe person, whether that is in a therapy setting or a friendship setting, but find someone safe. I think being able to share those pieces and parts that you think are ugly, that you think are unworthy of love or unworthy of being seen in a lot of ways. Find someone who will see those and not be deterred or disgusted or like even shook by those. And then I think too, as I've mentioned through the course of our conversation, is having so much self-compassion. And that has been revolutionary for me, is the shift from being so hard on myself, especially when me as a violent trauma survivor would look at people who did not go through what I went through and wonder why I wasn't like them. I think having self-compassion is so vital to healing. I think it's vital to functioning better. That when we have the tendency to beat ourselves up for not being normal, I think recognizing that behind those levels of trauma, we can find purpose, we can find meaning, we can find, even what I have been fortunate to find, which is really, I would say, my life's passion and work. And so, yeah, practicing self-compassion is key.
That's great advice. Yeah, you definitely have to have a lot of self-compassion for you to be able to get through to what you want to do, right?
Absolutely.
Now, Heidi, unfortunately, like I said, we are getting to the end of our session here. So I have a little surprise for you. Well, pretty much all my guests. I don't know if I had mentioned it to you prior to our conversation today, but as a thank you from Red Script Studios to all of our guests that are going to be published, I'm having my merchandise coordinator over at Creative Mayhem make all my guests custom Red Script Studio t-shirts.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's so cool.
Right. So hopefully we'll have that done. Well, we're in production of a couple different T-shirts right now. We just need to obviously raise the funds and revenue to be able to get the other ones made. So it could be a couple of months, but
Sure.
just know it is in the works. It is going to be on the way, and we'll be in touch to get a shipping address to get that out to you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
No, Heidi, thank you so much. Like I said, you reached out to me. You wanted to be on the show. It's the least I can do to say thank you and for having this amazing conversation and for giving such good advice and insights to our listeners. It's absolutely amazing. You're a remarkable woman, and I'm so glad to have met you.
Thank you. Yeah, you too. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Perfect. I'm so glad. Well, I'll let you go because I know you probably have a busy rest of the day ahead of you. And yes, we'll keep in touch about A, the episode publication, and B, the t-shirt.
Wonderful. That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome, my dear. We'll talk soon, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
And that was the very lovely Heidi Johnson, everyone. If you were moved by Heidi's story and passions, check her out on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and her website, www.angelcovers.org, for more information. Please consider donating or volunteering with Angel Covers. Your support would be greatly appreciated. This has been Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series, Columbine to Compassion, Heidi's Quest for Healing. Production copyright 2024 by Tim Douglas, proprietor of Red Script Studios. All rights reserved. If you love what we do, please support our cast by donating, becoming a patron, or by purchasing studio merchandise. Living Vicariously in the Trauma That Binds series is a nonprofit division of Red Script Studios. If you have a story you would like shared, consider reaching out to the studio. We would love to connect. Until next time.